and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, China takes a hard line on US tariffs, calling them blackmail. This as President Trump warns Beijing that retaliation would be a big mistake. Hard-hit global markets steady in Tuesday trading, clawing back some of the ground they lost on Monday. And the US President Donald Trump announces that the United States and Iran are to hold talks about the country's nuclear program. Tehran says the discussions will be conducted via mediators and will be held in Oman. Hello and welcome to the program. It has been 3 days since global markets began plunging after President Trump kicked off a trade war. Well, he did so by imposing tariffs on US trading partners, amongst them China, which has vowed retaliation. Well, President Trump slapped a 34% tariff on Chinese imports, and Beijing is vowing to respond with a 34% tariff on US goods. This just a day before Trump's tariffs are set to take effect, escalating the conflict even further. Well, President Trump has fired back, threatening to impose a 50% tariff if China doesn't back down.
As you know, against my statement, they put a 34% tariff on above what their ridiculous tariffs were already. And I said, if that tariff isn't removed by tomorrow at 12 o'clock, we're putting a 50% tariff on above the tariffs that we put on. So they've gone for years. They've become a rich country because of people, again, that were in the White House that allowed this to happen.
Well, to discuss this further, we're joined now by David K. Johnston, the former New York Times journalist and author of The Making of Donald Trump. Good to have you with us once again here on Al Arabiya News. We're also joined from London by Greg Swenson, the chair of Republicans Overseas. Great to have you both with us. Let me start with you, David. President Trump says for decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, raped and plundered by nations near and far, both friend and foe alike. Hence the tariffs. Has he got a point?
No, I don't think so at all, Tom. The United States has done very well because of trade. We certainly have lost a lot of factories, more than 50,000 of them, but they were also very low-value production. And the world is moving more and more towards services where the U.S. runs a big trade surplus, a surplus that could come under attack from other countries with retaliatory tariffs. Manufacturing is certainly important for the military, so we do that domestically. And we saw 700,000 more jobs in the manufacturing sector during the previous administration, while Trump in his first term lost manufacturing jobs through his policies.
Okay, let me turn to Greg. Feel free to pick up on what David just said out there. And I want to ask you what the logic is behind these tariffs.
Well, I think there's a few, and David alluded to the factories that have that we've lost, or the industrialization, the deindustrialization of the Rust Belt, especially the middle part of the country. So, and there's some merit to the argument that some of these factories might have been obsolete. We're moving into a more high-tech world, but I do think it's important, especially for national security reasons, to have supply chains at home. So tariffs can be used. Not perfectly, but they can be used to encourage the onshoring. But I don't think there's going to be a lot of tariffs. I think this is right out of the classic President Trump playbook of threatening the tariffs and then getting to the negotiating table. And you've seen 70 countries reach out to the White House in the last few days. You've got already you're seeing the deals being proposed. Vietnam folded first, or at least offered zero tariffs first. So I think, and then of course you saw the EU yesterday make that, offer at least a promise to negotiate. So look, I don't think there'll be as many tariffs as people fear. And if tariffs are so bad, I've always wondered, why do all these other countries use them? So I'm not convinced that tariffs will be harmful to the consumer like they say it will, because we didn't see that in the first term with those tariffs put on China. So look, I think there's a bit of alarmism here. I know the markets got spooked because they don't like uncertainty. I get that, but I do think there's some sensationalism here, and I'm not sure that we're going to see these escalations that everybody feared. And you're already seeing other countries, our trading partners, come back to the table to try to make it more fair and more equitable.
Okay, David, what do you say to that? Alarmism? And let's just face it. I mean, as Greg has said, I've got 50 countries. Greg says more like 70 countries have now returned to the United States on bended knee, as it were, saying, let's strike a deal before those tariffs do us any real damage. These tariffs seem to be having the desired effect, don't they?
Not really. First of all, understand I've known and covered Donald since 1988 when I wrote that he might become president someday. And Donald has long held this belief that tariffs are paid by the country where the tariff is applied. That's absolutely not true. It is a tax that is overwhelmingly, if not entirely, passed on to consumers. So it's inherently inflationary. The benefit of tariffs in a developing economy like the US was in the late 18th and the first half of the 19th century is it allows domestic manufacturers to raise prices and therefore build up financial muscle and experience to compete with other countries. The risks Trump is running with this plan, which has indeed gotten countries to come to him and bend their knee, and Donald really likes that. He very much is into this kind of power, are several. One risk is the U.S. may no longer have the dollar as the world reserve currency. If that were to happen, it would be devastating and a one-time downward adjustment, but a very big adjustment to the United States economy. Secondly, countries that are unhappy about this could create their own free trade zone and exclude the United States from it, which would similarly be damaging to the U.S., especially its great and growing success in exporting services, which are not being tariffed at the moment, rather than goods. And then to Greg's question about why these countries have tariffs, in not fully developed economies that are not robust and don't have detailed financial reporting that's widespread, tariffs are an effective way for governments to collect revenue. And that's why the U.S. relied on tariffs and duties early in its history.
Okay, Greg, let me ask you to pick up on some of that. I mean, these tariffs are risky because of the risk of collective retaliation, which could be extremely damaging to the United States. The US dollar, which has been the global currency of reference since the 1920s, might no longer have that status. What do you make of all of that?
Yeah, well, on the currency, there's always risk of that. I don't think it's a substantial risk. The Chinese currency, it will never be used as the reserve currency because they don't have the rule of law and property rights like we have. So that wouldn't really work. And then, of course, the European currency, which could be an alternative, is a collection of 28 different bond markets. So I think that's a bit of a stretch. I think in terms of using tariffs, as a revenue tool, it might be it might be a rounding error compared to what we take in income taxes. We didn't have income tax till the early 1900s in the U.S. There is some merit to that argument, but I do think. And Tom, what was the first part of the question? One was on the currency. What was the other one?
Retaliatory. Collective retaliation.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah. Look, I think it's clear that there will not be escalation or a so-called trade war with President Trump's response by using tariffs to the tariffs that already exist with our trading partners because of the trade surpluses that they have. The country with the trade surplus always loses in a trade war. So there's a little risk of that. That's why you're seeing the Chinese come to the table. You saw Vietnam come to the table first. The EU, same thing, $300 billion trade deficit for the US, surplus for the EU. They cannot afford that. They're much more dependent on trade than we are. We import 20% from China of what they export to us. I mean, sorry, we export 20% of what we import from China. So look, there's very little risk of escalation. I think the threats of that were very short-lived in the last few days. And again, that's why 70 countries are reaching out, even promising zero tariffs, which I think would be great for free trade and fair trade.
But David, what's your understanding? Are the Chinese showing any signs of coming to the United States negotiating table cap in hand? Is that how it looks to you? Because a lot of what I'm seeing sounds like the Chinese are saying, just you try us, we'll take this to the next level if we have to.
Tom, I think you're capturing what President Xi and the other leaders of the Communist Party in Beijing are saying, that they're very resolute. One of the major differences between American and Chinese governments is that in America, we think very short term. The Chinese, like the Catholic Church, adopt the position of we're here forever. And so they're willing to take their time. And notice around the world, a growing number of countries where the U.S. Was the largest trading partner of that country now have China as their largest partner. China's economy, its sophistication is growing. Its electric cars are taking over the world. And so the Chinese are in a very strong position relative to the U.S. on these issues. China certainly has a lot of problems. It's been very fiscally irresponsible internally. But so long as, like the United States, it can borrow in its own currency, it has zero risk of going bankrupt. It's only when you are subject to another country's currency that you are at risk. China is going to have a long-term strategy as well as a short-term strategy. And let's keep in mind that during his first term, Donald Trump dumped the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of which I was one of the leading critics in America, because I felt it reduced competition, which is critical to the benefits of capitalism. Competitive market capitalism is what we need. What we have increasingly is corporate socialism in the United States. China has been moving ahead with its plan for a trading zone. It hasn't gotten where it wants to go, but they have not backed off or gone away. They have patiently been building their ties and their influence. And Australia, the lapdog partner of the U.S., the single most loyal country of the U.S. in the whole world, more so than Canada, the Australians now have as their biggest trading partner China, and they are increasingly having their economy tied not to Washington, but Beijing. That should be a big warning sign.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is interesting because you're talking about two time frames here, the short term and the long term. And it prompted another thought in my mind, and this goes to Greg. I mean, there can be some immediate reactions to all of this and these threats from the United States. They may come in the form of capitulation, if that's the way we want to look at it, and the striking of a deal. But then there's going to be the longer term response, isn't there, which might lead to the United States being written off as being a reliable trade partner. I mean, is that a risk, do you think?
No, because we've been a reliable trade partner because other countries have taken advantage of our kindness, of our generosity, and that's no longer something we can afford. It was important after World War II to help rebuild the West and help build countries like South Korea and rebuild Japan. It was also important during the Cold War, but that's a long time ago, and we don't have the capability to service $36 trillion in debt. That's $1 trillion a year just in debt servicing. And I'm glad David brought up electric vehicles. You know, he's right. The Chinese are the biggest producer, biggest exporter. That's why the EU has 45% tariffs on Chinese electric cars. And so tariffs can be used in tactical situations because nobody wants to be dependent on the Chinese. The shipping is 50% of the world's shipbuilding is being produced in China. It's down to under 1% in the United States. So we do have to make some changes to reindustrialize to a certain degree. And that's again why, emerging countries had protections in place, had trade barriers and tariffs, because they had to industrialize. I think there's a little bit of that. Trump is playing the long game, even though, we have elections every 4 years. We're not going to see Donald Trump see many of the fruits of these efforts. It might take some time. But I think it's really important for the bottom 50% of Americans that have really not participated in the upside of global trade.
David, I want to turn to you. You're quoted as having said President Trump's ratings will continue to be good until such time as people discover his economics are not good for them. I mean, that's clearly in the context of these tariffs. I mean, what do you see these tariffs doing to the average American consumer?
Well, it will help the average American. I don't know that it's good for those of us in the top 10% that own 88% of the equities in the U.S. and the other 40% own 12% of the equities. 50% of the people don't own equities. So if they had $1 in 2021 when Biden took office, that dollar is worth 80 cents now in purchasing power. If I put it in the stock market on day one of Joe Biden, it's worth $1.80. So I think, those of us with financial assets and property are doing just fine. We do very well. We did very well during the Obama years. The lower quartile, the lower decile, the working class people did so much better in the Trump years. Real wages went up 8% in 4 years. That's 4 times the wage growth in the Obama-Biden years. So I think people will understand this is good for the bottom 50%. And if those of us in the top 50 have issues with that, well, I'm not sure that, I'm worried about it. We're going to do just fine. And so It's time to sort of reindustrialize and help the people that have seen the power of a dollar is worth, the dollar purchasing power is worth 26% of what it was in 1980. And so global trade has been good for those of us in the top half or those of us that live on the coast, not so good for those people living in the Rust Belt.
Yeah, Greg, go ahead.
Hey, Greg, the question was directed to me.
Yeah, it was David. It was David. I'm sorry. Go ahead and let you answer that question now.
Apologies. Sorry. I didn't know that, David.
So there are a number of things that I agree with Greg that those of us who have property and assets are doing just fine in America. But there are a number of things that Greg said that aren't supported by facts. First of all, under Biden, for the first time, the median wage rose faster than the average wage. I've been documenting for 30 years each year the distribution of wages in American incomes. And under Trump, gains went to the top, combined with massive tax cuts for people in the upper reaches of the 1%, mostly the over $2 million a year crowd. Secondly, in the United States, there is a serious problem with people not having sufficient incomes. The bottom 50% certainly do not. Well, tariffs are inherently inflationary, and we're already seeing inflation has ticked up from an annual rate when Biden left office that was below the post-World War II average to about 4.8% annualized. Now, we don't know if that'll continue. We only have 1 month's data at this point. But tariffs will lead to higher prices, and overwhelmingly because they're on goods and lower income people spend all of their income or nearly all of it on goods and services, it's going to hit people down the income ladder. So this is not good for most Americans. Now combine that with the plan to borrow another $4.5 trillion to continue for 10 years the U.S. income individual and corporate tax cuts, which are being financed with borrowed money. And you're creating increasing problems for people at the bottom half, and I would argue basically the bottom 80% or so of Americans. Tariffs will be helpful if we were to get factory production that paid living wages, which would mean the revival of unions, and this is a virulently anti-union president. And I also want to make sure viewers know about a hypocrisy of Donald's. When Donald was involved in building his hotel in Las Vegas, he went to extraordinary lengths to evade a tariff on Chinese steel. He talked about American jobs, but he bought Chinese steel and went through a series of sham companies to hide that the steel was Chinese. And that's indicative of how Donald does business. Do as I say, not as I do. And so I don't see at all how the tariffs are going to benefit the bottom 50% and probably the bottom 80% of Americans in the short run or in the long run.
Okay, Greg, let me ask you to respond to that, plus the comment that from the same section I was quoting from just a moment ago when I put that question to David, who says that Donald Trump is a con artist at heart, he says. What do you make of the fact that he's
also a misogynist and a fascist and a racist and anti-Semite? Yeah, we've heard it all. So that's, I'd like to stick to what's important here. And I think, a few things. One, on the tax cuts for in the first term, 93% of Americans got tax cuts. When you have across the board tax cuts, yes, rich people get the bigger chunk because they make more money. So, that's just natural. But they were not just for billionaires. That's just a typical Democrat talking point. The other thing to keep in mind is inflation in the Biden years was caused by reckless spending and hostility to the supply side, to the private sector, especially in the energy sector. So are tariffs inflationary? I'm not sure, because the data doesn't really prove that. They weren't inflationary in the first term. The MIT is saying that only 20% of the tariff gets passed through to the consumer. And I do think that if they were so inflationary, why does the EU use them? Why does the UK? Why does China? Why does Vietnam? There's not any rampant inflation from those tariffs. The inflation came from reckless spending and, again, hostility to the supply side, and when Biden tried his best to punish the energy sector. So these are things that, we saw. People might not have missed President Trump, but they missed the peace and prosperity from his term. Fantastic economy, excellent wage growth. Real wages adjusted for inflation went down 3% in the Biden years. That's not a good thing. Granted, they went down a lot more in 21 and 22, and they bounced back in 23 and 24. But net down 3% in 4 years after being up 8% in the Trump years and up 2% in the 8 years of Biden Obama. So I think the economic argument is laughable from the left, and I think that this is disruptive. Absolutely. That's the nature of this president, but it'll work in the long term for workers by reshoring production, by returning some good blue collar working class jobs to the Rust Belt, to the middle of the country. And in the near term, we have tax reform and massive deregulation this time around, much greater than in the first term. That will liberate the private sector. That will liberate the energy sector. And that's good news for working people who can't afford to put gas in their car right now, or petrol in their automobile. So, this is great news. We're seeing lower energy prices already. We expect to see that even more as the energy sector gets reliberated by President Trump.
Okay, some flawed economics on the left, and tariffs are not necessarily inflationary. David, your response?
Well, in fact, Donald Trump lost manufacturing jobs. Joe Biden brought back over 700,000 more manufacturing
with
jobs.
$9 trillion of stimulus.
Investments, and excuse me,
borrowed stimulus.
He made massive investments. Excuse me, under Biden, we had massive investments in manufacturing, especially high-tech manufacturing in the industries of the future. In Donald's case, we saw massive subsidies to cons like the Foxconn project in Wisconsin that was nothing but a pile of mud that cost a fortune. We had to subsidize grain farmers because Donald lost much of the soybean market to the Brazilians through his mismanagement of the economy. And we saw that, the thing that Greg keeps leaving out is that under Biden, the wages of people in the bottom half rose much more quickly than people above. It was a leveling out of top pay that went down under Biden. The number of people making over $100 million a year for their labor fell by half, from about 500 to about 250. That's why the overall number appears to be down. It was a leveling out of super high paychecks. Well, the paychecks of people in the bottom half were rising, and all you have to do is study the Social Security data, and you can see that in detail. And I study those every year. I think that we're in a period here of a great deal of uncertainty, which is not good for business. The new Canadian Prime Minister has said the U.S. is no longer an ally of Canada. 11 Canadian premiers, essentially governors, came to Capitol Hill a month ago when I was there, and They literally asked leading members of Congress, is Donald Trump going to invade Canada as we last did in 1812? And they're serious about it. People who live in Canada, including one of my grown children, they talk constantly about when is the U.S. going to send tanks and soldiers and overwhelm Canada. That's not good diplomatic relations. That's not good economic relations. And that's all part of the fundamental problem with Donald Trump, which is he's appallingly ignorant. He's a man who didn't know why there was a memorial over the battleship Arizona in Pearl Harbor. He thought Finland was part of Russia. He thought Frederick Douglass, who's been dead for 130 years, was alive today.
We're going a little off piece here.
He's a con artist, and that's the crucial thing you need to know about him.
Greg, I'm sure you want to jump in and respond to some of that. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, Trump derangement syndrome is alive and well. It's funny. It always gets personal with the criticisms of President Trump. And, you know, we've heard the story 1,000 times, and it's one of the reasons he won the election in 2024 was sort of the condescending questions from the left. You know, how could you vote for a man who did X or did Y? And that's not what people care about. They care about their wallets. They care about the open border, the mass illegal migration problem we had, and of course, inflation that again was caused by reckless spending and hostility to the supply side. So we can cherry pick some numbers and talk about a Foxconn plant or whatever, but overall, the voters really appreciated what they saw in the first term and were really disgusted with what they saw in the Biden term.
Can I just ask you a quick question, Greg? Because we've heard anger from the Chinese Foreign Ministry at what they've deemed to be ignorant and impolite comments that came from the Vice President, J.D. Vance. He said this, he said, we borrow money from Chinese peasants, his words, not mine, to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture. I mean, this is pretty extraordinary language to be coming from the upper echelons of American leadership.
Yeah, the vice president's not afraid to use aggressive language. But I think what are you more offended by? Aggressive language or the fact that we've been importing cheap and slave labor from China for 30 years by outsourcing our production to those factories in China? So I'm not worried about salty language. I'm worried about the fact that China's using cheap and slave labor. I see it in Africa where I do business all the time, in agriculture and mining and timber, and they bring in slave labor, prison labor from China. They don't employ local people. This is a very mercantilist, aggressive country that, yes, they're doing business with Australia, but Australia will not let them own anything in the Australian market, and we're very close to them as well. So these are difficult times. I think most of the problems are with the Chinese and Chinese mercantilist economic aggression, and I think the world is really fed up with it. And so you'll see some reshoring, some rebalancing of supply chains, and I think that's a good thing.
Okay, David, your thoughts on that? I mean, this is essentially a row between the world's top two economies, and we're going to see a better and more level playing field as a result of all of this. Your thoughts?
Well, there are unquestionably major problems with the conduct of China: theft of intellectual property, the use of slave labor, which was exposed, I should point out, by the New York Times, that supposedly leftist newspaper. And China has acted in its own interest, just as the U.S. should. But Donald Trump is not someone who believes in competitive market capitalism. He's not a businessman. He's a cash extractor, and he's a mercantilist. That was the prevailing theory before Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. It's the idea that if you have a piece of gold, I don't have it, and the only way to get wealthier is to get your piece of gold. Growing the economy, creating new goods and services, and using profit motive to have that happen is what grows the world economy. Donald, who I have spent hundreds of hours with and know very well, unlike Greg, Donald is a mercantilist. He does not believe in competitive markets. He is given testimony under oath that makes it clear he doesn't believe in competitive market capitalism. And that's the crucial thing to maintain. And one of the things that's happening in this country is literally a belief among many people that competitive market capitalism, that markets are a lefty idea. That's absurd. And some of Greg's comments I find offensive because my best-selling economics books champion competitive market capitalism, and they expose corporate socialism. And Donald Trump, through and through, is a corporate socialist.
Okay, let me ask Greg to respond to that, in particular, his defense of the comments he made that have offended you.
No, I mean, I think President Trump's liberating for the private sector, for the private economy. I think that's absurd. If he was, competitive as a businessman, and any businessman wants to be mercantilist, wants to be in a monopoly position. That's called business. You try. It's not something that works ultimately, because we don't believe in monopolies. But I think what David just described was the Chinese economy, a mercantilist economy. So I don't really buy that. But I think David and I could agree on one thing. I am not a fan of corporate welfare, and I don't think that the president is either. We want competition back in the U.S., and I think by liberating the supply side, getting out of the way is basically what the Republicans believe in. Is let the private sector allocate capital, not the government. So much of what we saw in the Biden years was government stimulus. $9 trillion of stimulus for $7 trillion in GDP growth. It's just bad math.
Okay, David, we gave you the first word. We're giving Greg the last word, and that was it, because we're out of time. Thank you both very much indeed for your time today. Greg Swenson, Chair of Republicans Overseas.
David.
David
Thanks,
K.
Tom.
Johnston, thank you very much indeed to you as well. Well, President Trump's tariffs have sparked a whole range of opinions, even from his core supporters. Well, the billionaire hedge fund manager Bill Ackman, who backed President Trump after the July assassination attempt, took to X on Sunday, calling the new tariffs, quote, an economic nuclear war. Well, he urged the White House to hit pause on the levies. Well, other CEOs who had bet the Trump White House would be good for business are now speaking out as well. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Viky Pryce, an economist and former head of the UK's Government Economic Service, who joins us from London. Thank you very much for being with us, Viky, here on Al Arabiya News. I mean, it looks, doesn't it, like the markets have found a slightly firmer footing in Tuesday trade. I mean, would you say this is the end, therefore, of the market turmoil?
Well, I would say that a lot of uncertainty still remains. We have been seeing this turmoil happen. Because, of course, the tariffs which President Trump announced were considerably higher than anyone had anticipated. So that certainly spooked the markets. And then we started hearing all sorts of suggestions that perhaps there would be a pause in the extra tariffs that go above the 10% base, which he has already imposed, and possibly above the tariffs that he has imposed against car inputs into the US, 25% for cars. It was also going to apply to parts as well as of the next couple of days. And then, of course, we are worried about what it means for steel and aluminium. And there are some concerns about the 25% being extended to pharmaceuticals. But the fact that there is even suggestion of a possible pause or maybe even discussions. I think we've been hearing that there are now talks going on between the US and Japan, we hear, and 50 other countries are already trying to discuss with President Trump what arrangements there may be to avoid some of those extra tariffs. All that has, I think, got the market thinking that perhaps some of those tariffs are reversible. And I think that's what we're seeing. If for some reason it proves not to be the case, then we might see a resumption of the decline.
Yeah, because I mean, that was really the calculation made by Washington, wasn't it? That countries would come to the US cap in hand and say, let's make a deal. And those tariffs would never really have to become a reality. I mean, this was only ever going to go one of two ways, wasn't it? Either those countries would come cap in hand, and it looks like they're starting to do that, although it's not all the countries in the world, of course, and China's not one of them, it doesn't sound like, or else there was going to be collective retaliation. I mean, any signs of that?
Well, we have seen some retaliation already in Canada, for example, and so that's happened. And there have been, quite a lot of suggestions of which products might be included in retaliatory action by, say, the EU. So they've already produced a list of things they intended to put extra tariffs on. We've seen a long list in the UK, I think something like 8,000 products possibly. But it's interesting what you say, that this is perhaps part of a plan which might indeed give some fruit at the end of the day. But in reality, quite a lot of countries, before those extra tariffs were imposed, had talked to the administration in Washington and offered all sorts of things, including the EU, including a number of other countries which said, okay, we're not going to put any tariffs at all, even considering what they might do on the services side. And what surprised the markets, what surprises governments as well, and one of the reasons why we started hearing about retaliation, is because none of those efforts really were met with any recognition that those discussions were taking place, that those offers were there. So actually what they're offering now is not very different to what they had offered before. From the EU side, for example, the offer seems to have been for some time, take out all the tariffs on industrial goods coming in from the US. That seems to not have gone anywhere. So maybe now that the shock has taken place, it's possible that maybe we are going to see some greater willingness of the US to show its upmanship, if you like. And we might indeed see some of those offers made by various countries be more readily accepted. But they're not going to be terribly different to where they were before. People have been working on this for some time.
As an economist, I'd love to get your opinion on the arithmetic and the calculations that went behind the numbers that were came up with by the Trump administration for these tariffs. What did you make of it? I mean, did it sound to you like well-considered, carefully thought-through arithmetic?
I could say all sorts of things about it, but perhaps the answer would be no. It didn't seem to be well calculated or make any sense whatsoever. And look, for example, at the UK. I don't know, if indeed you were trying to punish any country which has a deficit with the US, the country that has a surplus, and therefore the US has a deficit with it, then you wouldn't have picked the UK, because there is no, on the goods side, any deficit. Sometimes there is a small surplus, sometimes there's a little deficit that is there, but overall, we're talking about balance. And yet, the UK got 10% base, and also the 25% on cars, and the 25% on steel and aluminium. So yes, it makes no sense. I mean, no, it makes no sense.
I want to ask you, President Trump has said to China that if they retaliate any further, there'll be an additional 50% of levies on Chinese imports into the United States of America. I mean, that would bring overall duties on Chinese goods to 104%. I mean, that's really uncharted territory, isn't it? What would that mean for Chinese imports and for the Chinese economy and the US economy, for that matter?
Well, the Chinese economy has been adjusting away from relying too much on trade, of course, for a while. And it's adjusting also by reducing its exposure to the US. I think the US has been protectionist for quite some time. So what we're seeing with President Trump is just a continuation, except in an exaggerated way, of what we've been seeing now for a decade at least. We saw it in his first term between 2016 and 2020. We saw it with Biden. Of course, President Biden, who had his Inflation Reduction Act, was basically subsidizing production in the US and making it very hard for anyone else from the outside to compete unless they manufactured there. So this is just a continuation of it all. Already, of course, we know that the export of electric vehicles from China can hardly happen in the US because there's a 100% tariff that exists already. And there are tariffs on all sorts of other things. Now, what China has done already itself is impose extra tariffs on agricultural products, for example, making it more difficult for various categories of goods to come into China. But of course, it is a very large tariff imposition. And it's not going to be particularly good for Chinese growth. It's going to have to divert its exports to somewhere else, or indeed concentrate a lot more on developing domestic demand. And it's doing that with a lot of reflation that's taking place in China right now. So there's a stimulus going on, which I think is probably going to result in perhaps domestic growth being a little bit stronger, not relying so much on exports. But it does mean that for the world as a whole, we're talking about slower growth. It isn't just the imposition of the tariffs. They could, of course, suddenly be taken away, not necessarily on China, but on others But what we've got now is a world where there is so much uncertainty. We still don't know whether if you're doing A, you might get B, and how long that B, if you like, that outcome will last. So that means less investment, less growth. And countries will look a lot more carefully where they put their investments in the future.
I mean, in terms of the global economy, I mean, how close, how far off do you think a global recession might be now at this stage?
Much will depend on what happens in the US, of course, which is still such an important trading partner, whatever happens. And of course, everyone is revising their estimates for the US, possibly a recession, because of course, there's going to be a considerable increase in costs. And of course, if they get reversed, maybe that isn't going to be that bad. But what we've seen so far is on what we knew until recently, and a few days ago, that is, the World Trade Organization has itself reduced its forecast for trade growth, so the volumes of trade across the globe, from +3% to negative -1%. I mean, that's quite major. Trade is hugely important for world growth. If you move from growing trade to reducing it, a little bit like what we saw with COVID and with other crises that we've had before, then the world gets into a really poor growth pattern. And it's not necessarily the case that all countries will see a recession. We still have a lot of emerging markets likely to be doing reasonably well, but I think for the West, it doesn't look that good.
Some are saying the United States is becoming, quote, unrecognizable. One of those people is Stefan Buzna, the CEO of Euronext. I mean, when people start talking about the United States as becoming unrecognizable, and this is coming from traditional established trading partners, I mean, are we looking at a situation in which, countries start thinking the US is so unreliable a trade partner, we're going to have to start really looking elsewhere to sell our products and really reduce dependence? I mean, do you see this as having long-term reputational damage?
Well, it's already been happening up to a point. As I said, the US has been protectionist for a bit now. It's not new, but it is still a very big market. And it has generally grown quite a lot. One of the reasons why it has such a big trade deficit, it's suddenly increased very significantly over the last 5 years, is because during that period, post-COVID, the US has grown quite substantially. If you look at where it stands by comparison to pre-pandemic levels, it's over 12%. That level, if you look at Germany, it's negative. It's actually below where it was pre-pandemic, and the other countries are somewhere in between. So it is a big market. And it has been importing rather a lot as a result, whereas the rest of the world has not been importing that much and has been exporting. So it is a function of growth rates, and you can see how important the US has been in sustaining growth over the last few years. So we can't count it out, but it will be interesting to see whether the uncertainty that's been created really causes a shift in both investment and trade flows away from the US in any sustainable way. But as I said, we might suddenly see that everything's reversed, trust is restored. It's a very uncertain time.
Are there any winners in all of this? Do you see, I mean, for example, Russia wasn't on that board of targeted countries by the United States. I mean, could they stand to benefit? Who stands to benefit in this context?
Well, on Russia, the truth is, of course, there are so many sanctions against it, and assuming they're at all operative, because what you find is that have been able to circumvent them. But anyway, there are lots of sanctions on their products, so perhaps it made very little sense to add extra tariffs on top, since quite a lot of restrictions already exist, not just by the US, but also from the EU and others. In terms of winners, it's really difficult to imagine who it would be, because you've now seen that some tariffs which have been imposed on the goods produced by some of the developing countries in Southeast Asia, for example, are so punitive that they really, really endanger their growth prospects. And that's not good news. I'm finding it rather hard to imagine how it would be, except, of course, for countries that really haven't been affected by this extra change that's taking place, which are Canada and Mexico. Which have had loads of exemptions already, but of course we've seen the period when there was indeed a lot of animosity, and we're seeing what's going on the political front in Canada. But even there, where there hasn't been anything extra, but there was already quite a lot of tariff imposition before, we've seen growth forecasts slashed. So, for example, Canada, instead of growing by 2% or over 2% this year, is now expected to grow by less than 1%, and Mexico to move into recession. So I find it hard to see who will benefit. Trade intensity matters hugely. The more trade there is in any country, the faster your productivity grows, and also the faster your economy grows. And trade flows have been very beneficial with their increase over the last few decades, and doing anything that disrupts that is bad for all.
Just lastly, I mean, to wrap up this conversation, I mean, we're looking at a pretty tumultuous chapter in modern economic history. We don't know how long the chapter is going to be, but it's tumultuous for sure. I mean, what's your hunch moving forwards? Are we going to have that more level playing field that the United States is hoping to get, a more advantageous trading relationship from the point of view of the United States? Or do you think this is a gamble that will go down in economic history as having been a major act of self-harm on the part of the United States?
Well, as an economist, I would go for the second. But it all depends how things are amended, if you like, over the next few weeks, and probably needs to be done quite quickly in order to restore that trust. The worrying thing for me, when you look at crisis, because we've had one crisis after another. So if you just look at more recently, we've had the financial crisis, we've had COVID, we've had the war in Ukraine. What happened in each of those crises was that there was a lot of coordination of policy across, with the US taking a lead on cutting interest rates, on quantitative easing, on regulating again after the deregulation that had taken place, the banking system, on up to a point, although it hasn't quite followed what the Europeans had wanted to do, but nevertheless. And then again, reacting and agreeing to react to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there was a lot of common ground. And the interesting thing now is that the rest of the world finds itself, in fact, fighting one country, big country, which was an ally and actually very often the leader in crisis. And that is really what is turning the whole thing topsy-turvy. And that's why it's so tumultuous and such a shock.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. A pleasure talking to you as ever. Viky Pryce, economist and former head of the UK's Government Economic Service. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Now, longtime foes, the United States and Iran, are set to hold talks this weekend over a potential new nuclear deal. That's according to President Donald Trump. Well, hours after that surprise announcement, Iran's foreign minister clarified that the talks in Oman would be indirect, but they would represent both an opportunity and a test, said Tehran. Well, President Trump, who withdrew the United States from the 2015 nuclear deal, said the talks would be, quote, at a very high level, and he warned Iran that it would be in, quote, great danger if those talks failed. Well, Sir Mark Lyall Grant is a former UK ambassador to the United Nations and a former UK national security advisor. He joins us now from the United Kingdom. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. News of these talks on Saturday in Oman. I'm wondering if that fills you with optimism. What could be achieved?
Well, I think it is a very significant moment because it is direct contact between the Trump administration and Iran. And there is the potential opportunities for both sides, I think, to normalize the relationship and perhaps get a deal. But I think it's going to be very difficult. And I think the stakes are very high for both sides now in this negotiation.
I mean, for people who don't follow Iranian affairs too closely, and I must admit, we haven't spoken much about Iran in newsrooms in recent months. There have been lots of other issues on our radars. I mean, how would you characterize the state of relations between Washington and Tehran right now?
Well, there aren't any. It's as simple as that. There hasn't been diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran since 1979 and the Iranian Revolution and the hostages siege, the overrunning of the American embassy in Tehran. Since then, there have not really been any direct contacts, except in the context of the negotiations for the so-called JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that was agreed back in 2015. And actually, I was the UK negotiator, so was involved in a lot of those negotiations. And in the margins of those negotiations, there was some direct contact at high level between American diplomats and Iran. But otherwise, there's basically no bilateral relationship between the two at all. And since President Trump pulled out of the deal in 2018, he ramped up sanctions against Iran. So I think it's fair to say that this would be a significant moment of senior level direct contact between the two countries.
Right, so it's been 7 years nearly since President Trump tore up that 2015 deal between Iran and six world powers, a deal that you say yourself worked on. I mean, I don't know what your initial reaction was in 2017-18 when that deal was done away with, but has your opinion of that decision changed? I mean, do you think with the benefit of hindsight, President Trump was right to have done what he did?
No, I don't think he was right. I think the problem was that he ripped up the deal without actually having a plan B. And so we've now reached the situation 7 years later when Iran is closer than ever to acquiring nuclear weapons, and President Trump faces exactly the same quandary that we faced back in 2015 of trying to prevent Iran's nuclear program diplomatically, with the alternative being bombing Iranian nuclear sites, which has obviously unforeseen potential consequences. No one quite knows where that would end up. And that's why I say I think the stakes are very high for both sides in this, because if President Trump does a deal that is considered to be not a very good deal, having said that the 2015 deal was the worst deal in history, he will not be seen to have come out of this very well. On the other hand, if he can't secure a deal with Iran, then of course he will have to follow through on his threat to engage in military action against Iran with all the sort of unforeseen potential consequences that that has. So the stakes are very high for the United States, I think, in this negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, President Trump quoted last night as saying Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And as you're saying, you know, this is not a new issue. For more than 20 years, there has been tension between Tehran and world powers over this same very issue. But how can we be sure Iran doesn't already have a nuclear weapon?
Well, I think we can be reasonably sure because the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Authority, has had some ability to verify until relatively recent to inspect some of the nuclear sites. So what we know, because they announced just a couple of months ago in Switzerland, that the Iranians have about 60% enriched uranium of 275 kilos. Now, you need, for a nuclear bomb, you need about 90% uranium enrichment. But that is quite an easy step to take, and that amount of enriched uranium would allow them to have, theoretically at least, 6 nuclear bombs. So they are very close to acquiring nuclear weapons. You know, what the Americans will want out of these negotiations is, firstly, a sort of complete dismantlement of the nuclear program. They will also want verification of that, and that's going to be extremely difficult. Is it going to be the IAEA? Is it going to be the Americans themselves that do that verification? But they will also want to have some guarantee that Iran will stop being a malign actor in the region and stop supporting proxies that are threatening both Israel and the United States, because that was President Trump's main complaint about the previous deal, that it only tackled the nuclear issue. It didn't tackle Iran's malign regional influence. So America is going to go into these talks on Saturday with a very high bar of demands, and ones which the Iranian authorities may not feel able to meet, not least because Iran has seen what happens if you do voluntarily give up a nuclear program. They saw what happened in Libya, and they've seen what happened in Ukraine, the two countries that went through that process.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what sort of a position the Iranians go into those talks in, because we've talked extensively on this channel about the damage that's been done to Iran's influence in the region. It's had its wings clipped and lost an ally in Syria. It's lost the same strength of ally it had in Hezbollah that it had, let's say, a year ago. I mean, does Iran go to those talks in a weaker position than it did, say, in 2015?
Yes, that is certainly the case, because I think, for one thing, the Israeli missile strike on Iran in April last year demonstrated how vulnerable Iran is to military attack. And even though the nuclear sites themselves, the most sensitive nuclear sites, are deep underground and perhaps relatively well protected, there are lots of potential targets if it came to military strikes by a combination of both Israel and the United States. So yes, they've lost influence in the region. Yes, they are militarily weak at the moment. Yes, they are domestically quite divided. With Ali Khamenei, who's now 85, there's questions of the succession, there's some unrest within the country. So there's no doubt that Iran goes into this in a relatively weak position. And they will see an opportunity in this, to normalize relations with the United States, get the sanctions lifted, be sort of more integrated back into the global economy. So there is some potential big wins for Iran, but are they going to be willing to actually give up in a very verifiable and permanent way their ambitions to be a nuclear power? I rather doubt that, frankly.
I mean, when we were talking about, for example, the exploding pages that sort of gave away the positions of a lot of operatives in Hezbollah and really signified the beginning of the end of Hezbollah as we knew it in Lebanon, it was reported widely that Hezbollah had been massively infiltrated, severely compromised. The same was being said of some sections of the Iranian apparatus. And I'm wondering to what extent you think, the Iranians have been massively compromised, and whether, again, that further weakens what you've already said is an even weaker position than the position they negotiated in a decade ago.
Well, I think they probably have been compromised. And of course, we've seen an example in the past of a successful cyber attack against the Iranian nuclear program, which successfully delayed their process for several years, in fact. But it doesn't, I don't know now whether they are still so vulnerable to that sort of cyber attack, because the advantage of the cyber attack against the nuclear program, of course, it's sort of deniable and it doesn't involve kinetic military activity. But what Donald Trump is promising or threatening is a full-scale sort of military strike against targets in Iran if Iran does not accede to American demands. But as I say, American demands are going to be quite high in this negotiation, and I'm not sure that Ayatollah Khamenei will be willing to accept those terms.
Yeah, and they're likely to be more stringent terms and more demanding terms from the US delegation than they were even a decade ago, not least because we can assume President Trump will take the opinions of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu very much into consideration.
Yeah, that is absolutely the case. And another important distinction between now and 10 years ago is the fact that this is a bilateral negotiation between the United States and Iran, whereas 10 years ago, it was a multilateral negotiation, which included, on our side, as it were, and the Western side, both Russia and China. And the force of the deal, the value of that deal in 2015 was that it was endorsed, agreed, verified by not just the United States and the UK, France, Germany, the EU, but also Russia and China. This time, one of the advantages, in a way, that Iran has is that it has support from Russia, to whom it had been very helpful in the Ukraine conflict, and still is, and also China, who doesn't really care whether Iran becomes a nuclear weapons power or not, and is quite happy to help Iran avoid sanctions, Western sanctions on it. So in that sense, Iran is in a slightly stronger position because it's only facing the United States and not both Russia and China as well.
Yeah, indeed. And they face a brand new administration in Washington that is currently trying to fix lots of problems in lots of different places all at the same time. Just lastly, to wrap things up, before we cross to you, we heard President Trump in a clip saying that Iran will be in great danger if the talks fail. Assuming or imagining a scenario in which there is no accord forthcoming from those talks in Oman, where do you see things heading to from there?
Well, it's difficult to say. It's possible that, you know, Donald Trump's attention will just move on as it has moved on from the Middle East and it's moved on to some extent from Ukraine. If he doesn't get a quick win, he tends to move on to the next issue. And of course, the tariff issue is the sort of number one issue at the moment. But on the other hand, I think having said very clearly that Iran would pay a big price if they don't agree a deal, then I think his credibility will be on the line if he doesn't deliver some military response to Iran if there is no deal. So that's why I think the stakes are pretty high for both sides, both Iran and the United States.
Okay, so Mark Lyall Grant, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.